Hey everyone. Well, it's that time of year again, the year where every single movie nerd comes out with his top 10 movies of the year list. And I'm no exception. I do one of these every year. You know, I was looking back at some of my previous year's lists, most of which are on YouTube. Some of them I just posted on social media and I eventually transposed them to a letterbox list. But generally, I would change the order of many of the movies on those lists if I were doing them now, because sometimes how you feel about a movie initially upon release changes over the years. Some movies you end up liking more and you watch more and have more of an effect on you and that sort of thing. But we'll see how we feel about the 2023 movies now. 2023 as a year was, well, personally for me, it was better than 2022, but it wasn't a great year or anything. It wasn't a bad year either. It was just kind of a year that existed. Some good things happened, some bad things happened. Unspectacular. For movies, it was, well, it wasn't good for the industry, that's for damn sure. You had the strike, which kept production down for, the better part of the year, and a lot of the issues and fallout around the strike. Some stuff was preceding it. The streaming bubble kind of burst, and so the companies who run streaming services are now scrambling to make profits because, Wall Street was looking for growth, and they were able to ignore profits, and then when the growth stopped, they're like, where's our profits? And the streaming service was like, what do you mean profits? We just grow, we don't make profits. And then you realize that there's a ceiling to how many subscribers you can get and keep from subscriber churn. And you have Warner Brothers and David Zaslav just canceling finished movies for tax write-offs because they don't care about the art. And the Marvel Cinematic Universe imploded with, bad responses to Ant-Man and the Wasp and the Marvels and the box office of those. I think the only movie Disney released that turned a profit was Guardians of the Galaxy 3, and everything else they released bombed, or at least was not profitable in the theatrical market. And the DCEU, obviously it's been a lame duck for the entire year after they announced that they were rebooting it under James Gunn. So that was just a slow parade into, fiscal irresponsibility. It was rough for the industry itself, but there were, some surprises there on the business side. Barbenheimer was a big thing, and, you had a couple different surprises, but financially and business-wise, not the best. Quality-wise, however, completely different story. 2023 had a lot of really good movies if you knew where to look for them. Maybe some of the studio, big-budget, wannabe blockbuster stuff wasn't good, though some of it was. There was a lot of great stuff coming out of the indie market, and even, the rare mid-budget movie that was released. And because of that, I had a very difficult time whittling down my list to only 10 movies for once, which is surprising. There's some years where, even if there's great movies, I'm struggling to come up with 10. And then there's some movies where it's like, well, it's pretty easy to do it. This one, I have a fairly large amount of honorable mentions that I'm going to go through before I get to the 10. Just because they didn't make the cut, but I thought they were very good and deserved some sort of mention. So let's dive into honorable mentions now. So for honorable mentions, these are not going to be in any particular order. I just wrote them down as I remembered them. Thankfully, because I have Letterboxd, I can go back and look at what star ratings I gave movies that I reviewed, and that was able to help me sort of cinch in, what was in my general top. Before Letterboxd, I used to give movies letter grades with Letterboxd at star ratings, so I have a conversion chart on my Letterboxd. But pretty much anything that was like 4 stars or above is a movie that's at least an A- to me, and so that's kind of where I cut off the honorable mentions and whatever made the list. 4.5 stars is like close to an A+. 5 stars an A+. I didn't give anything a 5-star in 2023, but I'm very stingy with 5 stars, so unless it's an old favorite or just one of my favorite movies of all time or whatever, I very rarely give 5 stars, especially to a new movie that I've only seen once. But without further ado, let's at least jump into the honorable mentions. And I'm going to start with a movie that I watched tonight, the night that I'm recording this, which is December 29th. The Holdovers, which just launched on Peacock today, which is why I watched it. I missed it in theaters, and I haven't even had time to write a review for it yet. I probably won't write a full-length review for it until the day after I record this. But The Holdovers, it had a lot of Scent of a Woman vibes as far as, older person, younger person hanging out around, academia in New England where it's very snowy, and watching the movie made me very much happy that I don't live in New England anymore, even if it's not that snowy right now, just because I hated all that weather. But The Holdovers is about a boarding school in New England, and during Christmas break, and any student who can't go home for Christmas is stuck at the school. And it starts off as 5 kids, and eventually we only get to 1. Paul Giamatti is the curmudgeon-y antiquities teacher, and at first there is a butting of heads between him and the one student who's left over, but as time goes on they learn from each other, and it's that kind of movie. And it's executed very, very well. There's great performances. I think the screenplay is actually excellent. There's a lot of really quick, witty lines, and it's to be expected. This is an Alexander Payne movie, and yes, I'm aware of the allegations against Alexander Payne lobbed by Rose McGowan. I'm not going to let that sort of affect this movie because there's no parallel between the events of the movie and what supposedly transpired. But, he made Election and Sideways and a lot of those type of great movies where they're very much built on these comedic and yet very dramatic, sort of like heavy dramedy type movies with rich characters and a lot of interesting, I hesitate to say witty dialogue because it's not like rapid fire witty, but clever and certainly well written dialogue. And I don't know, it ended up being kind of moving in a certain way, and it ended up being pretty, I didn't cry or anything, but it ended up being a pretty emotional movie. And even though I'd seen all of the great reviews for it, it ended up being better than I expected when I watched it. So that's one of these honorable mentions. It's a near miss. It's not quite in my top 10. Holdovers might be 11, though, on there if I were to extend it beyond that. There was Barbie. Everybody saw Barbie. You saw Barbie. I saw Barbie. Everyone saw Barbie. It was the biggest hit of the year, over $1 billion. It added to the cultural conversation about feminism and misogyny and all that stuff. Ryan Gosling apparently had the time of his life being the comedic actor in it. Very fun movie, very interestingly designed as far as production design. I think Greta Gerwig and Noah Baumbach found the right angle into the material, because when they announced a Barbie movie, we all expected it was going to be like, Starlight Magic or one of these like ones that are just aimed at 6-year-old girls, and they found a way into the material. Little derivative of a Lego movie and stuff like that, but I felt like this sort of carved its own way, and it was an interesting approach to the material that could expand to, for a quadrant audience. I just thought it was extremely funny and very well made, and a lot of imagination was put into it, and not without some flaws. I think the Will Ferrell and the Mattel Corporation stuff didn't work out as well as that. There should have maybe been a clearer delineation between the Barbie world and the real world, but the real world's also cartoony. But otherwise, yeah, great comedy. Scream 6. I love the Scream movies. I got a ghost face tattoo on this arm here. We're probably not getting Scream 7 for a while because of all the shit with Gary Barber and Spyglass Media. But Scream 6, I saw it twice on opening night, and I very rarely see a movie more than once. But I saw the movie at the very early screening where you get the poster, and it was in 3D and everything. Didn't need to be post-converted to 3D, by the way. And then after I watched it, my initial feelings were that I really liked it, but I was unsure about 2 factors. Mild spoilers if you haven't seen it. One is that the movie didn't have the balls to kill off any returning characters, and I thought that was pretty weak. I believe they probably did that because of how much of a backlash there was to killing Dewey in 5, though I do think they could have swapped Dewey for Gale Weathers, and it would have served the same plot point, I think. But otherwise, I think they needed to kill one of them in Scream 5, so the movie could have stakes, even as Richie says in Scream 5. And 6, I think they pulled back a little bit, and I think that very drastically weakened the quality of the movie for me. I was also a little iffy on the ending. Not so much who the killers are or the reveal, even though it's pretty obvious in this particular movie. But the execution leaned a little bit more into the comedy. It's kind of how when Scream 2 came out, a lot of people did like Laurie Metcalf's kind of overacting in that one, which I never had a problem with. But it's kind of similar to some stuff that happens at the end of Scream 6. But when I watched it the second time, the not having the balls to kill off any returning characters, that still bugs me about the movie and is the reason it's not anywhere near my top 10. But the ending didn't bother me as much, and I've since watched it on Blu-ray at home or 4K at home, and my feelings are basically the same. I think it's not as good as 5. It might be equal with 4, or maybe a little bit above 4. I'm not quite sure there. Obviously, way better than 3. Scream 3 is an abomination, the only Scream movie I hate. But yeah, I still really, really enjoyed it, but it didn't make the list. No Hard Feelings, the Jennifer Lawrence R-rated comedy, which it felt very much like a Farley Brothers comedy from back in the day, where it's still a little raunchy, but it's not super crude. It's not Freddy Got Fingered or Tomcats, and it has a little bit of a heart to it and everything. I mean, it was nice to see Jennifer Lawrence. She took some time off for, to raise a family and shit. So seeing her come back in this sort of big, broad comedic role, and that newcomer they put in as like the little kid for the plot, not little kid, but because the whole plot is Jennifer Lawrence is a woman in her early 30s, and her parents hire her to try to take the virginity of their sheltered, nerdy son, and yeah. But I don't know, I laughed from beginning to end in the movie. I thought it was very funny. It's a type of movie that I missed, especially in theaters, because they're not greenlighting just plain old comedies for theaters anymore. It's like that's been ghettoized into streaming, and a lot of times it's like some shitty Happy Madison movie, like The Wrong Missy, that's not really very good. So it's nice to see one of these movies brought into theaters. I mean, it's not hilarious, it's not great or anything, but it is very, very, very good. And it's certainly one of the funniest movies I saw all year, and I highly enjoyed it. So, didn't quite make my best of list, but very good. Reality. This was a movie that came very close to getting in my top 10, but it's the movie about Reality Winner, the NSA whistleblower. She spent some time in prison. She's out now. And the movie was basically a transcript of the FBI interrogation of her as they were executing a search warrant at her house. And it's just, they film the transcript. All of the dialogue, or all that stuff is directly from the transcript. Stars Sydney Sweeney as Reality Winner. Normally Sydney Sweeney is typecast as, like what she is, the buxom blonde and everything. So even like in Anyone But You, a movie I liked this year, or, Euphoria or anything, she's certainly typecast as that kind of person, because let's be honest, Sydney Sweeney looks like if you typed hot blonde woman into the computer from Weird Science and she's what popped out. So seeing her get a role where her sexuality isn't part of it at all, and she can actually show a lot of acting prowess in it, was really great. And plus, this is a movie that has subject matter that is mildly related to things I know about in my personal life. Like, for instance, she lived in Augusta, Georgia, and she was stationed at Fort Gordon. I've been on the grounds of Fort Gordon. I've seen the outside of the NSA building there. That's as far as I'll go into this explanation. But regardless, I had some base knowledge of this event. And I really just liked how, when you see in interrogation in like Law and Order or whatever, it never feels like a real interrogation. So the fact that they used an actual transcript, and you can see the sort of tactics that law enforcement will use when they're trying to get information from a subject who is, trying to get through things, and how law enforcement already knows something and the suspect is not aware of what they know, and so that they're coming at it from different knowledge points and all of that stuff. And just sort of like just showing how an interrogation and search warrant actually happens, as opposed to how you see it in so many movies and everything, was really interesting. And it has its own tension, even though if you know the story, you already know what happens, and how it unfolds, and how they get pieces of information from reality, and how they are a bit manipulative, even if they're abiding by the letter of the law, and how they conduct things. How law enforcement is allowed to lie and deceive you during an interrogation type thing. But yeah, I thought it was an exceptionally good movie. It's unfortunate that, the rights were bought for HBO, so it didn't get a theatrical release or anything, but very, very good. Spider-Man Across the Spiderverse. This is one of those that's also almost on my top 10, but didn't quite make it once other movies came out that I saw. But, in a year where superhero fatigue has been a big part of the lexicon, and people just didn't seem very interested in the superhero movies we were getting, with the exception of Guardians of the Galaxy. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse was the best of the traditional superhero movies that came out this year. Obviously, the animation style is just gorgeous. It's just visually impressive. But it was also telling a pretty rich story. It's using the multiverse concept, which everyone's kind of tired of now, but it did it to its best effect, where, they could definitely play with all the different worlds and really utilize the different types of Spider-Man and the different proxies of different characters in different universes, unlike, Multiverse of Madness, which didn't make use of it at all except for a short montage. It had a villain that had a very understandable and believable motivation, and they're truly believing. I like when movies have villains that aren't just, evil for the sake of evil, but they have, sort of a method to their madness and, an understandable reason behind what they're doing, even if you don't agree with it, and that sort of thing. Plus, you get Spot, who's, the secondary villain, and probably going to be the more of a major villain in the next one. And that was sort of interesting how you take, a joke character and make them an actual threat. Plus, the lines about, my holes can take me anywhere made me laugh, as did the punk Spider-Man, what is that? Oh, it's a gaping metaphor for capitalism, mate, or whatever he says. So there's some good humor in there. The actual sequences are just virtuoso and everything. The music was great. So, I mean, for a year that had very underwhelming comic book movies and superhero movies, Across the Spider-Verse delivered. And, we'll have to wait a little bit for the next one, and there was a lot of allegations about mistreated animators on the movie, which kind of comes out with a lot of animated movies. But it delivered. I actually liked it more than Into the Spider-Verse. I thought this was a sequel that improved upon the original, and even though some of the detractors complained that it was only half a movie, I thought it still delivered quite well in its own sort of cohesive narrative, even though it does have a cliffhanger for, the eventual next one. Evil Dead Rise. Evil Dead Rise was a surprise, I guess. Not really, because, there's never been a bad Evil Dead movie. But it was nice to, this one was breaking away from, it's not part of the Ash Williams movies. It's not a remake of an Ash movie. It's the first film within the Evil Dead universe that it's complete own thing outside of Ash and Raimi, and not a remake or anything. And, it's set in, an apartment building, so you got that nice, closed location. They found a pretty decent explanation for keeping them in the building, which is what I was worried about. And, yeah, we've seen demons in a high-rise before. Demons 2, the Italian movie. But this was done really well. I liked that you had, this family and their characters that you care about. And it had, some good gore gags. Obviously, Maggot Mommy there, played by Alyssa Sutherland, was excellent and stood out. But there's a lot of good, visceral gore gags. It keeps the humor of Evil Dead with still getting the ominousness and the sort of the nihilism of those movies, despite the comedy. Great dark, visual style. Obviously, a lot of the Evil Dead movies are always visually interesting, especially the Sam Raimi ones, and this one was no exception. So this was a really strong horror movie for, the next one to reboot, especially since the movie was originally made to be an HBO Max original, and eventually got switched to theatrical, and yeah, I thought it was great. John Wick Chapter 4. Considering John Wick Chapter 3 is my least favorite of the series, and I thought maybe they were, on the down trend from this one, 4 really worked. It's a 3-hour-long action movie, which is already, not common outside of India, maybe. And while it touches on much of the same material from 3, I think it does 3 better. If anything, John Wick Chapter 4 makes 3 completely useless, because 3 just feels like the diet version of 4, the not as good version of 4. And John Wick 2 is my favorite of the series, by the way. But I think 4 did well. I've always liked this John Wick universe with its own mythology, and, that it's not an action movie that takes place in the real world. It takes place in its own unique world, where you have this world of assassins that works on top of our world, and bulletproof thin business suits are a thing, and all of that stuff. So it's kind of silly, and I only watched one of the 3 episodes of that Peacock show, The Continental, because 1, it didn't seem like the universe in that TV show matched the universe in the movies very well, and 2, it just wasn't very good, so I never finished it. Maybe I'll eventually finish it at some point. But I thought John Wick 4 did, if it truly is the end of the series outside of spin-offs and stuff like that, because we got that ballerina spin-off with Ana de Armas coming out, I thought this was a fitting end to this storyline, to this series. And obviously Keanu Reeves is still great. The supporting cast is great. And the action sequences, especially the top-down one that looked through all of the rooms, the one I'm talking about, or the staircase and everything. It's over the top and surreal and not a realistic action movie by any means. And while I do love a grounded action movie that uses squibs instead of digital blood explosions and all that stuff, and I prefer squibs to digital stuff like you see in John Wick, I thought John Wick 4 did a great job with this sort of epic action movie on the run thing. Cobweb was kind of a divisive movie, I want to say. There's a lot of people who love it and are calling it this year's Malignant, and a lot of people who just didn't like it at all, or it was just too unrealistic for them, whatever. And I actually like this much better than I liked Malignant. I mean, Malignant's a fun movie, but it is what it is. But Cobweb had a very specific tone, and I think that tone is what people either were on board with or not. And that tone was R-rated Goosebumps book. Like, more so than that shitty attempt at making a Goosebumps TV show with Justin Long. I only got 2 episodes through it. Or even the pretty fun but kind of mediocre Jack Black Goosebumps movies. Cobweb actually had the tone and the feel of a Goosebumps book when you read it as a kid, except that it's R-rated with R-rated gore and all that stuff. It feels a lot like Stay Out of the Basement, the second Goosebumps book, in some of how it's executed. But I like that, yeah, it's not realistic, and it has a very specific tone. It has this very interesting, like, grayscale visual style, and it has a lot of over-the-top flourishes, like their entire backyard. The family in this movie has, like, a pumpkin patch in their backyard, and that's not realistic at all. And yeah, I mean, it does sort of fit into this mini trope of movies that feature something living in the walls of a house, like The Boy and everything like that. Though I think this is probably the best of that miniature trend or subgenre, or whatever you want to call it. Anthony Starr and Lizzie Kaplan are great in it as the parents. They find, like, the right tone of, like, the maybe crazy parents from a Goosebumps book. And that's really all I thought about while watching it, is that it is the R-rated adult version of a Goosebumps book, that it captures that sort of subjective childhood feeling and, heightened reality, but in this style. And, as someone who, and horror fans will come at me for saying this, who has not always been a big fan of Trick or Treat, the anthology movie with Sam, Cobweb is a movie that, much like Trick or Treat, actually, like, encapsulates a Halloween atmosphere into it. Like, a lot of movies take place at Halloween. Scream 6 took place at Halloween, didn't quite capture the atmosphere very well, aside from that subway with everyone in the costumes. But Cobweb feels Halloween-y in its tone and atmosphere, and I really appreciated that. So Cobweb was a surprise for me. I really enjoyed that. Saw X, who would have guessed that the 10th Saw movie, which takes place between the first and second Saw movie, would actually be as good as it is. And I like that. The reason I think everyone liked this one so much, aside from the fact that it focused on Tobin Bell for the first time in a while, is that it starts off as just a character drama about a man dying of cancer. It's, it's like 40 minutes of terms of endearment before it turns into a Saw movie. And it makes you, like, really care and empathize with our psychopathic libertarian serial killer, John Kramer. And I really liked that approach to it. It was a novel approach to the Saw series, because the Saw series, ever since the second one, has been very locked in and regimented into its formula. And sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. I happen to love all of the Saw movies except for Saw 5, so I'm a big fan of the series. I rewatched the entire series leading up to Saw X, and I even rewatched the original Saw in theaters on 35mm for the first time earlier this year as well. And I liked that Saw X, it still gave you everything you want in a Saw movie. It still takes place in, like, a dingy warehouse. It still has traps and gore and, the twisted philosophy of John Kramer. But I like that it took this different approach to the structure of it. It's not about, law enforcement investigations and all of that stuff. And plus, it found the idea that, if it's kind of like Don't Breathe 2, where if you're going to make your protagonist a bad person, that you have to make your antagonist an even worse person. And Saw X did this very well. So it's Cecilia. And speaking as a Saw apologist, I'm someone who also liked Spiral from the Book of Saw. Saw X was the best Saw movie in a while. I think I may rank it third in the series now, third or fourth from where it is now. But, you don't expect the 10th installment coming off of 2 previous installments that weren't terribly well received by the fan base to be one of the best, but here we are. And then lastly, this is kind of a twofer. These are 2 movies that are similarly themed in some way, so I'm grouping them together. One is Sanctuary, the movie that takes place within a hotel room and is about sort of a battle of wills between some rich dude and his dominatrix. And Fair Play, which is about 2 stock traders who are in a secret relationship, and the woman in the relationship gets a promotion that the man thought he was entitled to, and that sort of puts them at odds in their relationship, and it goes over different gender dynamics and the way that just men are just pieces of shit toward women, basically. I think Sanctuary is the slightly better movie, because Sanctuary is doing something that's a little bit different. Sanctuary is sort of like, what if you took 50 Shades of Grey, or what 50 Shades of Grey pretended like it was trying to do, which was trying to show an actual love and romance blossom out of a BDSM relationship. And it did that in a more realistic way. It made the man the sub, and it made the battle of the movie is not about breaching consent or anything like that. It's more about a battle of wills between whether these 2 people are going to admit that they're actually in love with each other and not just in a transactional BDSM relationship with each other. Plus, Margaret Qualley is quickly becoming one of the best young actresses in Hollywood. Yes, I know she's a Nepo baby. She's the daughter of Andy McDowell. But between the Claire Denis movie that she was in, and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and this, she's very quickly becoming one of my favorite young actresses in Hollywood, and I think she's very talented. I'm looking forward to Drive-Away Dolls next year, which was pushed back because of the strike. And then Fair Play, it was maybe discussed prior to release, because it premiered at Sundance, Netflix bought it, and then Netflix ended up releasing it. It was discussed when it was at Sundance as being an erotic thriller, and it's not quite that. And as someone who loves erotic thrillers, that maybe threw me off a little bit because I was somewhat expecting something it's not. And then I also heard that it was basically kind of about, how men and women butt heads in the workplace and relationship dynamics, and it is kind of like that. But watching the movie, it's not like a he said, she said thing at all. It is very clear that it's about a terrible man who is selfish and doesn't actually love his girlfriend, and a girlfriend who bends over backwards to give him the benefit of the doubt. And it's really just about how women will go to the extra length to capitulate themselves, to try to win over men or not hurt their feelings or whatever, even when men are being absolute scum. And that's not quite the movie I was expecting, but because it was exploring these issues in a way I haven't quite seen in a film to this extent, I highly, highly enjoyed that. I've seen some criticisms about some of the scenes and some of the acting. I do not share those. I thought Fair Play was very, very good, and it almost made my list. Without further ado, now that I've gone through a very hefty amount of honorable mentions, it's time to do the actual top 10. So, the number 10 movie is Paul Schrader's Master Gardner. Master Gardner is probably the last film, maybe, of a loose trilogy of movies that Paul Schrader has made that started with First Reformed, which was, I think, my second favorite movie of the year that came out, and then The Card Counter, which was my second favorite movie of the year that came out, and now this, which isn't as good as those 2 movies, but I still liked, I think, more than the average person or critic did. And it's hard for me to say why Master Gardner hit me as well as it did. I think, I like the concept of this reformed neo-Nazi who ends up becoming like a horticulturalist and everything, and how his, both a sexual desire that he doesn't want to admit to himself, as well as a desire to redeem himself, end up sort of coming to a head with some challenges that he was not expecting to happen. And, it covers a lot of, like, the modern political scene and stuff like that, but it comes at it at a good angle and not it's like a super preachy angle or anything like that. Joel Edgerton does a great, is great in the lead performance, even if he's starting to look like Conan O'Brien these days. And yeah, it just really affected me. And there's one line from the movie that has stayed with me, and I don't really know why, because it doesn't pertain to me personally or anything. But Sigourney Weaver, who plays the owner of the manor of which the garden that he works at is attached to, calls something that he's doing obscene. And Joel Edgerton just kind of calmly looks at her and is like, "No, I've seen obscene." And that line affected me, and I can't quite understand why. Or I can't quite articulate why, I should say. So, Master Gardner, I mean, I really like Paul Schrader, and this was no exception, so that's number 10. Number 9 is Martin Scorsese's 3.5-hour epic Killers of the Flower Moon. I mean, if you're a cinephile, you've already seen this movie. But if you're not, Martin Scorsese, he has been unfairly maligned as someone who only tells the story of, white men criminals, or some people have claimed that he has glorified the criminal life. And you need to lack a whole bunch of media literacy to come away from his movies with that interpretation. People walked away from The Wolf of Wall Street and they thought that Jordan Belfort was not being condemned by that movie. And, maybe they were thinking that because Leonardo DiCaprio, who plays Jordan Belfort, became friends with the real-life Jordan Belfort. But let's not hold Leonardo DiCaprio's personal predilections against the movie itself. But that movie was very much an angry look at the excesses of, that type of person. And I'm not sure how you can come away from Goodfellas or Casino or some of those other movies thinking that he's endorsing criminality. But Killers of the Flower Moon is where he sort of at least extrapolates that outside of traditional organized crime and goes to, this sort of slow-motion capitalist genocide that took place against the Osage people in the early part of the century. And, he chose to focus not on the law enforcement investigating, which is a story we've seen before, but on the evil that was perpetuating that, both the person at the top, played by Robert De Niro, who is just the most two-faced asshole in the world, as well as the Leo DiCaprio character, who is, almost in denial about his evil, and, he's, lying to himself about loving his wife that he married to get, oil rights and everything. And, I think the 3.5-hour running time is justified for this particular movie, and to its benefit, it's paced very well. It does not feel like 3.5 hours. It feels long, but it does not feel like an epic-length movie. And then that last epic sort of coda at the end, where Martin Scorsese has a cameo, is just sort of the most unique and yet perfect way to end a movie based on a true story that I've seen in a long time. And, it's... what can I say about the direction, the editing, the score, the acting? I mean, anything I say about this movie you've already heard a million times because this is going to end up on a lot of lists, and it's sort of the very obvious pick to be on a list. Some people may be shocked that it's this low on my top 10, but it's Martin Scorsese. It's great. Watch the movie. Number 8 is Anatomy of a Fall, the Palme d'Or winner. So, when I was in my early 20s, I saw Steven Soderbergh's American remake of Solaris. I saw this one before I saw the original Russian Solaris. And the concept behind that movie is basically that there's a planet, and the planet can take your thoughts and make them manifest into reality. And so this guy's dead wife comes to life, but it's not her, it's just his memory or perception of her. And because his wife had killed herself, this perception of his wife also keeps killing itself when it is materialized by the planet. And the concept behind the movie basically is that you can never really know another human being. Even someone who you may know better than anyone else knows them. Because you can't jump inside their head, you will never know them. You will only know your constructed perception of another person. And that's always been a concept that's intrigued me very much. And Anatomy of a Fall is similar to that. Not about necessarily a person, but about just truth in general. The idea that, unless we experience something firsthand in front of us, or there's like video evidence that's not doctored or whatever, the drive to know absolute truth is something that is sort of ingrained in all of us, and yet it's something we can never grasp. And especially with true crime and all of this stuff, it's sort of like, we can never know the truth. We can just take our evidence, but sometimes there's just going to be situations where you have evidence to different parts of an event on both sides, and you ultimately have to make a choice based on whatever, your own intuition. And Anatomy of the Fall is a movie about that, where, a man falls out of a window to his death, and was it suicide, was it an accident, or was he pushed by his wife? And a lot of the movie is just about, we get different pieces of evidence, we get different first-hand accounts, we get different interpretations, but at the end of the day, we can't truly know what happened. And it's sort of like, if we can never truly know the truth of objective reality, how do we decide what to believe to move forward? And that's the main crux of the movie, and that's something that very much appeals to me. So aside from having great performances and a movie that, very interestingly to me, takes place within the French legal system that I don't know very much about, so seeing those courtroom scenes was very interesting just on that level, and as someone who likes legal system stuff. But I really like that the movie explored that theme and explored it very well, and I like where the movie ends up leading us with those concepts. So yeah, excellent movie, great movie. Absolutely go see it. Number 7, How to Blow Up a Pipeline. I'm a communist, of course this was going to be on my list. What were you expecting? So How to Blow Up a Pipeline is a movie about a group of environmental activists who want to blow up an oil pipeline for the environment. Part of it is revenge, because this oil company has poisoned and sickened some people. Part of it is just general ideological feelings. But the idea is, can you blow up this pipeline and stop what this company is doing in a way that doesn't kill anybody? So like a Weather Underground type thing, where, the Weather Underground, back in the 70s, they blew up a bunch of shit without killing anybody for leftist radical reasons, and this is kind of similar to that. It's loosely adapted from a non-fiction book that is more, not so much how to blow up a pipeline, but why you should blow up a pipeline. That's basically the crux of the book. It's about sort of justifying radical action to protect the environment against capitalist interests. And the movie is about a group of different people from different walks of life and even different political backgrounds who are coming together to enact this scheme. And it basically treats an act of eco-terrorism as something that the audience is meant to agree with. So it's the rare overtly pro-terrorism movie, aside from Star Wars blowing up the Death Star, but we will call that. And it takes the form of a heist movie, and as far as its construction, where it's about getting the gang together and the planning and the execution and things that go wrong in the execution, and how they deal with improving for when it goes wrong, So it's like Ocean's 11, but for radical leftist direct actions. But I thought it did an excellent job, and obviously it helps that I happen to very much agree with the film's radical leftist politics. But I just really like the idea that you take the template of a heist movie and you apply it to basically a 70s social activism movie that would have been made by leftist Hollywood people during Vietnam or something. And yeah, this was much higher on my list for a while, and then I just saw some other movies and it got bumped down a little bit lower. And it's not a movie that is really being discussed as far as award season goes or anything like that, maybe because it's viewed too much as a political item as opposed to a filmic item. But yeah, I loved it. How to Blow Up a Pipeline. Number 6 is Past Lives. I heard rave reviews of Past Lives going into it, and then I go to see it, and during the first half hour of the movie or so, I'm watching it and I'm like, this is good, but I don't understand why everyone is saying it's like one of the best films of the year. And then by the end of the movie, I felt like someone had punched me in the fucking chest. So, obviously as the movie went on, it won me over, and it became just so much more emotionally powerful as it goes on. Because the basic premise of the movie is that there's a little boy and a little girl, and they're growing up in South Korea, and the little girl moves away with her family to the United States, and, they were, young puppy love, childhood loves or whatever. And they reconnect many years later as adults, in like the early 2000s. For one reason or another that you see in the film, things don't quite work out. And then it comes to the more modern age, and the woman is married. The guy is single and just had a breakup, and the guy decides he's going to come to New York City to visit her. And the movie is sort of about soulmates or fate or whatever. But the way I interpret it, or the approach I took into the movie, is that it is about how so much of love and matters of the heart aren't about fate or destiny or anything like that. Who you end up with isn't necessarily the person you're meant to end up with or whatever. A lot of it is sometimes just about proximity and timing. And, the movie is dealing with fate and some other concepts of it, and some people walk into the movie feeling some way about fate, or kismet, or serendipity, or inchan, or whatever it's called in the movie. But I mostly just came away from it that so much of who you end up with is not about grander romantic ideals or whatever, which isn't to say it isn't about love or anything. It's just sort of about time and opportunity. Because in the movie, after things don't work out when they attempt to rekindle things in the early 2000s, the woman is at a writer's retreat and she meets one of the other guys, and that's who she marries. And when it comes to the modern age, it's clear that there's a certain connection between the man and the woman that is always going to be there and is never going to be broken. Maybe you can even argue that they should have been together or whatever. But now she's married to this other guy, and this other guy's great, and they do love each other. And it's not like he's an asshole keeping them apart or whatever, like in a love triangle movie or whatever. He's like a legitimately good guy, and it's not his fault that she knew this person before they met, and it's not his fault that they fell in love with each other and this other person happens to exist or whatever. And so I really liked that approach to, maybe you would have been a better match with this other person you used to know or whatever, but you ended up with this other person, and it's not a bad deal that happened. Maybe this one would have just been slightly better. And I don't know, it's just, maybe post breakup, in the 2023 year of being single, the concept of who you end up with at certain times in your life being just about timing and opportunity and proximity was really hitting me. But yeah, I may have teared up a little bit at this one, and it profoundly affected my emotions to the extent that I still remember the feeling months after I've seen it. And it's a great movie. It's going to be an award season talk, and it deserves all that talk. Number 5 is David Fincher's The Killer. As you know, I am a David Fincher fanboy. I've got a Fight Club tattoo on my back. I love everything David Fincher's done. Mank was my favorite movie of the year it came out, which is the one Fincher movie no one seems to like. Well, there's some people who don't like Benjamin Button either, but they're wrong. So I am very predispositioned to love a David Fincher movie, and I loved The Killer. And I'm also so happy that despite being a Netflix movie, it was one of the few Netflix movies that actually got a theatrical screening near me at my Alamo Drafthouse, because Maestro, which sucked, and a bunch of other movies did not from Netflix, but The Killer we got. And thank you. Thanks that living next to an Alamo Drafthouse has gotten me, not next to, but near, has gotten me the ability to watch both Mank and The Killer on the big screen. So I'm still seeing all Finchers on the big screen. But The Killer is... What I loved about The Killer is that as someone whose favorite movie is Fight Club, The Killer comes across as David Fincher's anger at the people who misinterpret Fight Club as like some Andrew Tate document or something. Like, there's a lot of Fight Club fans who are the toxic men who would join Project Mayhem, or the people who think that everything Tyler Durden said was right and that he didn't, become a fascist who was betraying his principles by setting up franchises and shit. There's a certain person who misinterprets Fight Club and takes the wrong message from it, and it's that person who ends up making Fight Club like a red flag movie if someone calls it one of their favorites. So it's like, no, I actually truly do understand it, you know? And the killer is sort of like David Fincher's fuck you to the people who misinterpreted Fight Club, because the main character spends the first half an hour of the movie giving like super serious like Sigma grind set voiceover only for him to fuck up his assassination. And the contrast between who this man is in his own head and what we see happen is great. And yeah, I mean, some people have also said that it's just Fincher riffing on himself, almost like it's a Fincher commenting on a Fincher movie, as opposed to just Fight Club specifically. And it still has a lot of his tropes and a lot of his anti-capitalist imagery and stuff like that. But I just love the idea of him doing this movie that is sort of in intertextual dialogue with the part of his fan base that he hates. And, Michael Fassbender gives this great, like, he got the tone right for this sort of comedic performance. It's the movie's very episodic in the way it is, and so it streams together very well. Obviously, I love the David Fincher look of, everything barely being illuminated but still being able to see, and that green-brown color palette that he sort of digs into, and the very methodical usage of different things he has going on, different shot choices and everything. Great use of digital effects that are fairly seamless in a lot of the movie as well. For a guy who always complains about CG, man, Fincher knows how to use the CG. But yeah, I mean, if you like Fincher, then this is a whole lot of Fincher in one movie, and I especially loved it as someone who is a Fight Club fan and sort of interpreted the movie as that sort of intertextual dialogue between Fight Club and its fan base and Fincher in this film itself. So, yeah, excellent. It's on Netflix. Just watch it if you haven't. Number 4 is Lathimos's Poor Things. Poor Things is... it's a movie that has a lot of the same messaging of Barbie, but in a very hard R rating package that is... how does one describe Poor Things? Poor Things is... It takes place in a visual world that is very stagey. It's almost like that director, I can't remember how to pronounce it, but Millier, the Trip to the Moon guy. It's very much a movie where the set design is like on cardboard and, has like different rear projection and interesting like old school, almost silent film effects and almost Salvador Dali-esque in some parts of it. But this very constructed, fantastical world, it's a little Terry Gilliam, a little, all of that. And it's just this wickedly funny movie about a woman coming of age and adapting her own agency and learning who she is in a world of men who try to imprison her and confine her and control her and mold her into what they want her to be. And so it's much like Barbie, it is a feminist view of women have to operate within a patriarchal world, but it does it in this very ribald and outlandish Yorgos Lanthimos movie. Emma Stone gives the performance of her career as well as of the year. Like, there's no further need to deliberate, just give her Oscar now and we're good. It's, like, her performance, I mean, not just, like, all of the nudity and the sex that she has to do, which is brave enough for any A-list actress to do nowadays, in our, very sex-negative worlds that we're in as far as sex scene discourse goes. But just how she has to basically act like she's a toddler in an adult body and then gradually transition through a coming of age where she has to have the brain of a teenager and finally the brain of a living adult, and all of trying to play different ages and different time frames of human self-actualization within the movie is there. Plus, it's just fucking funny and gorgeous to look at. And, you got Willem Dafoe as, like, the Dr. Frankenstein-type character who was abused by his father. And you got Mark Ruffalo as perhaps the single funniest thing in any movie this year. It's just this wild, bizarre eye candy with thematics under it. It's, it's sort of... a little Guillermo del Toro-esque in the fact that it's, like, not eye candy, it's eye protein, as he likes to say. But just kind of a wondrous, delirious movie, and the type of movie we just don't see made nowadays, as far as just the freedom that this man was allowed to make this very unmainstream artistic movie with this sense of humor. Like, it's amazing that this movie is playing in some multiplexes as well. It's also amazing this movie avoided an NC-17, considering how the MPAA goes these days. But I guess, being released by technically Disney, who owns Searchlight now, is, deep pockets help that MPAA rating. But yeah, this is like a fantastic film, and kind of blew me away when I saw it, and absolutely one of the best of the year. Number 3 is Oppenheimer. You saw it, I saw it, everybody saw it. It grossed almost $1 billion. It was one half of the Barbenheimer. It's a Chris Nolan movie, and he's like the one auteur that can get people in seats just by his name alone. Yeah, I mean, what can be said about Oppenheimer that hasn't already been said? You got murderer's row, just riches upon riches as far as the cast goes. You got this, this great introspective look at a man who is thinking he's doing the right thing and, may have created the thing that will destroy the human race. And the tackling of the guilt and the enormity of that, and the short-sightedness of policymakers and their decisions, and there's so much richness going on in the movie. Plus, again, as a communist, I'm going to love any movie that portrays every single communist character as positive, and every single anti-communist character as the worst human being who's ever lived. So... especially coming from Chris Nolan, where some of Chris Nolan's movies have kind of right-wing messages, especially like Dark Knight Rises. For him to direct a movie that is so sympathetic to leftists is very interesting and great. Florence Pugh plays like the world's hottest communist in the movie. It's great. So, yeah, there's a lot more articulate, rich things you can read that I felt about this movie in my Letterboxd review. And for any of these movies, since I'm just kind of covering them in brief here, you can read my much more articulate and lengthy and full-length thoughts on my Letterboxd reviews for all of them that I've written. I'm just kind of giving little snippets, little log lines of my opinions here. But yeah, Oppenheimer, it's an achievement. It is, not just business-wise and how it got people into the theater and excited to watch a movie in 70mm IMAX, even if you're not a hardcore cinephile and all of that stuff. It is just sort of one of the crowning achievements of Christopher Nolan's career, and the fact that a heady, intelligent movie that is mostly 3 hours of people talking in boardrooms became such a huge hit and such a huge part of the public discourse, that can only be a good thing for cinema. Number 2 is Talk to Me, the A24 movie made by the two YouTubers. Yeah, I've seen a lot of people love Talk to Me, and I own the Talk to Me hand, and a lot of people disliked the movie and thought it was overrated. I am in the former camp. I thought Talk to Me was brilliant. And what I loved about Talk to Me so much is, one, I'm generally not as big a fan of supernatural horror movies as other types of horror movies. So like ghosts, demons, because I'm an atheist and don't believe in those things, they don't affect me as much as some other people. But this was a movie about ghosts or demons that hinted at an interesting mythology, and that sort of took me, that some sort of people, when they die, they just live in this empty, lonely, black void, and when this ritual allows you to interact with others for even like a brief period of time, you latch onto that and you don't want to let go at all. It's like a life preserver out of purgatory type thing. And how this interacts with a bunch of kids who are, just trying to do like a TikTok challenge or something with this hand and this possession ritual. And I do like that it sort of incorporates something that like Gen Z or young people would do now, because so much of the horror genre, I feel, is about reaching back. It's about recapturing slashers or recapturing different types of movies that have been made before, or paying credit to this era of horror movies or that era or that subgenre or whatever. And Talk to Me is one of the few horror movies that I feel is sort of moving things forward, where it's like, okay, we're never going to have a movie where a character doesn't have a cell phone, so that glorious era of horror movie is lost, so you're just going to have to find a way around it, or they're just never going to have a signal in the United States for some reason. But I like that it moved forward into this world of, well, one, cell phones can't fucking help you, but also of incorporating how young people might interact with something supernatural today if it actually existed, and what the negative consequences of that would be. And yeah, there's a little bit of an addiction metaphor in there too, if you want to read it as that, maybe social media addiction or drugs or whatever. There's definitely dealing with trauma, and a lot of people are just tired with horror movies dealing with trauma a lot these days. I mean, most of life is trauma, so I don't see that as a trend, as just that people are just noticing that trauma is a big thing. There's some movies that are dealing directly with the concept of trauma, but I don't think this is as much one of them. Yes, the protagonist is dealing with the death of her mother, but it's not about sort of trauma specific. It's more about grief and the inability to let go to things, but I like the hints of mythology as far as how the afterlife works and all that stuff. I like that it leaves some questions open, like, are these ghosts who they claim to be, especially the ghost of her mother, or are they just lying to get their point? Are they trying to bring people, what is their ultimate goal aside from, having a few minutes of living in the world so that they don't mind kissing a dog, stuff like that. And I just was very impressed by the universe and the mythology that's created. I really liked how the characters were integrated into that. I liked how the gore wasn't huge and out there, but it was very effective where it was implemented. And I just thought, as far as like a pure horror movie, aside from my number one pick, as far as a pure horror movie goes, and all of the horror that we got this year, this was definitely the best of a movie that I can just call straight ahead horror. So yeah, I really loved Talk to Me, and it's so far the only movie I saw from the Regal Mystery $5 movie on Mondays that I not only liked but loved, because there was a whole lot of shit I saw when I was going to see those Regal Mystery movies. Not going to do that no more. And finally, my number one favorite movie of 2023 is one that came out in January of 2023. So this has been sitting at the top for the whole goddamn year, and that is Brandon Cronenberg's Infinity Pool. I really liked his last film, Possessor, and I think it was this year that I finally caught up with his first feature, Antiviral, and I really liked that. Infinity Pool, I think, is his best feature so far. And, there are two themes in a movie where if it's going to cover both of those themes, I'm probably going to be inclined to like it. And it's basically about the inhuman misanthropy that the rich have, especially for the poor, and how the rich are just horrible bourgeois piece of shit sociopaths. And it's also about toxic masculinity, or not necessarily toxic, let's say fragile masculinity, where the main character is someone who is financially supported by his wife. The only reason he got his first book published was because his wife's father is the head of the publishing company, but he has writer's block and can't do a second book, and he feels undesirable, and he just feels like a loser and doesn't have it. And so he allows people feeding his masculinity to draw him into their horrible rich people crimes, which happen in a fictitious Eastern European country where if you're rich enough, you can buy to have a clone with your memories made so that you don't have to suffer from your own crimes, and you're allowed to commit all sorts of crimes against the poor locals because they want tourism dollars. So you have that sort of thing about kind of like the Hostel thing about how U.S. people treat the rest of the world like their playground because of their ethnocentric goonery and all that stuff. All themes that I love and am predisposed to love inside this really weird fucked up package where, the movie was cut for an R rating in the US because our country is fucking babies. But the unrated version was released, or the uncut version was released in other countries, including Canada. So I originally bought an unrated Blu-ray from Canada to see the full version, and eventually Neon released a domestic version in 4K in the US, so I was okay double dipping with that. So I've seen the R-rated cut, I've seen what would be the NC-17 cut, which they tried to appeal and was denied by the MPA. And, I just love there's some excellent, gorgeous visuals in this movie, much like there were in Possessor. The orgy scene is shot in a very unique manner, and there's some very grotesque, interesting effects during that. And, just Brandon Cronenberg just directed the hell out of this. So, if we're talking about Nepo babies that we love, as I mentioned earlier with Margot Qualley, the son of David Cronenberg is one of my favorite directors of all time. the fact that his son is also a extremely talented director whose films, while still very much weird and certainly vibing with the same vibe of his father's movies, are aimed in different directions and have different aesthetics and are going toward different concepts and things like that. I feel like David Cronenberg is a little bit more concerned with ideological, philosophical stuff like that, and Brandon is more concerned with more tangible concerns about things. And so his great, broad, satirical, fucked up look at fragile masculinity and the evils of the bourgeoisie, of course, was going to appeal to me, and that's why it rode the entire year out among a lot of competition and a lot of great movies to continue to be my favorite film and probably best film of 2023. So there you have it. There's my list. But again, like any other year or any other person's list, it is just one person's interpretation and one person's opinion. So if you actually watched this whole damn video and you saw enough movies this year to make your own list, share them in a comment. So you hit me up on my socials. You can go to Letterboxd to read the reviews. You can go to TikTok and Twitter and Insta and all that stuff to see what memes I'm posting or whatever. But you can also just drop me a line as far as what your lists were. And where do you disagree with me? Or is there a favorite of mine that are like, hey, you suck, you shouldn't have put that on there, I don't like that movie? Or was there a movie I left off and you're like, fuck you, you suck, and any person who doesn't put Godzilla -1 in their top 10 has no business making a list? Joe Russo doesn't watch my videos. But, if you have a strong opinion that's different from mine, or you just want to share your own list, drop it in a comment below. But anyway, thank you for watching however long this ended up being, and, I hope you have a good one, and I hope that 2024 is a better year, and that we get some great movies. Fingers crossed at what they got released going on.